The storm did not break in a single moment, but spread like a fracture line beneath the surface, silent at first, then suddenly impossible to ignore. And at the center of that unraveling stood Cain, a man who had believed perhaps too stubbornly that love, loyalty, and instinct would always guide him toward the truth. What he received instead was a revelation so cold, so calculated, that it stripped away not only his certainty, but his sense of self. Nikki's words did not feel like information. They felt like a verdict, one that rewrote everything Cain thought he understood about the past weeks, about Lily, and most painfully, about himself. The idea that there had never been danger, that the fear gripping him had been manufactured, twisted his memories into something unrecognizable. Every frantic decision he had made, every sacrifice, every moment of desperation, now stood exposed as part of a game he had never realized he was playing. And the realization did not just wound him, it humiliated him. What lingered most heavily was not the betrayal alone, but the precision of it. This was not a spontaneous deception, not a moment of weakness or fear, but a carefully constructed illusion, one that required planning, coordination, and above all, intention. Cain could not escape the thought that Lily had chosen this, that she had stood at a crossroads and deliberately stepped into Victor's shadow, aligning herself with a man known for turning people into instruments of his will. That choice haunted him more than any lie, because it suggested that whatever connection they once had was no longer strong enough to anchor her, no longer enough to stop her from becoming part of something darker. And in that realization, Cain felt something shift inside him, something irreversible, as if the version of himself who still believed in her had been quietly erased. As he replayed everything in his mind, the cracks widened. The urgency in Lily's absence, the fragments of information that never quite aligned, the emotional distance that he had dismissed as stress, all of it began to take on a new meaning. He saw now what he had refused to see before, and the clarity did not bring relief. It brought a deeper kind of torment, the kind that comes from understanding too late. Because Cain was not just confronting what Lily had done, but also his own blindness, his refusal to question, his willingness to trust even when instinct might have warned him otherwise. And that realization fed into his anger, turning it inward as much as outward, creating a volatile tension that threatened to break through at any moment. Lily, meanwhile, stood on the opposite side of that storm, but no less shaken by it. What she had once justified as necessary, as strategic, now felt dangerously fragile under the weight of exposure. She had told herself that she was navigating a situation she could control, that aligning with Victor was a temporary compromise, a means to an end. But the truth was far more complicated and far more damning, because at some point, the line between participation and complicity had blurred, and she had crossed it without fully acknowledging what it meant. The moment she allowed Cain to believe their children were in danger was the moment she ceased to be merely a player in Victor's plan and became a co-author of its cruelty, and that was a reality she could no longer escape. The thought of facing Cain filled her with a quiet dread that she could not suppress. It was not fear of confrontation, but fear of recognition, fear of seeing in his eyes the reflection of what she had become. Because Cain had always been someone who saw her clearly, who understood her in ways others could not, and now that same clarity threatened to expose every flaw, every compromise, every choice she had tried to rationalize. She knew there would be no hiding from him, no easy deflection, no carefully crafted explanation that could undo the damage. And beneath all her defenses, there was a growing awareness that she had not just risked losing him, she had ensured it. When they finally stood face to face, the air between them felt heavy, charged with everything that had not yet been said but already understood. Cain's composure was unnerving, not because it suggested calm, but because it hinted at something far more dangerous: control. A control that existed only because everything else had already shattered. His silence was not hesitation, but restraint, as though he were holding back a flood that, once released, would be impossible to contain. And Lily felt that restraint like pressure, each passing second tightening the space around them, forcing the confrontation into inevitability. Cain's first need was not to accuse, but to confirm, because even in the midst of his anger, there remained a fragment of hope that this could still be undone, that Nikki had been mistaken, that there was some explanation that could restore the world to what it had been. But that hope was fragile, and as Lily struggled to meet his gaze without offering the denial he needed, it began to crumble. The truth did not arrive as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet, devastating acknowledgement, and in that moment, Cain felt the last of his illusions fall away. There was no misunderstanding, no misinterpretation. It was real, and it was deliberate. The second wave of realization hit harder, sharper, because it reached into something deeper than trust. It reached into the core of what he believed about family. The idea that Lily had allowed him to think their children were in danger was something he could not reconcile, not with the woman he thought he knew, not with the values they once shared. It felt like a violation not just of him, but of something sacred, something that should have remained untouched by strategy or manipulation. And as that understanding settled in, his anger transformed, becoming less explosive and more resolute, less about reaction and more about judgment. This was not something he could dismiss or forgive lightly, because it represented a boundary that, once crossed, could not be easily redrawn. For Lily, that was the moment when the weight of her actions fully manifested. She could see it in the shift of Cain's expression, in the way his pain hardened into something colder, more distant. This was no longer just about being caught in a lie. It was about the consequences of a choice she had made, with full awareness of its risks. And the worst part was that she could not even argue against his perspective, because deep down, she knew he was right. She had used something that should have been protected, and no justification could erase that fact. The final question did not need to be spoken to carry its impact. It lingered in the space between them, an unspoken challenge that forced Lily to confront not just what she had done, but what it revealed about her. If the roles were reversed, if Cain had been the one to manipulate her through fear for their children, would she have understood? Would she have forgiven? Would she have accepted it as part of some larger plan? The answer came to her with painful clarity, and it stripped away the last of her defenses, because she knew she would not have forgiven him, not easily, perhaps not at all. And that realization left her with nowhere to hide, no argument to make, no ground to stand on. Behind it all, Victor's influence remained undeniable, a silent force that had shaped the entire situation without needing to be present. His ability to anticipate reactions, to orchestrate events from a distance, had once again placed others in positions where their choices became predictable, almost inevitable. But what made this situation different was that his control was no longer absolute. Cain's awareness disrupted the balance, introducing an element of unpredictability that even Victor might not have accounted for. Because Cain was no longer reacting from a place of trust or hope, he was reacting from a place of disillusionment, and that made him far more dangerous. As the confrontation reached its emotional peak, there was no resolution, only a shifting of lines that could never fully return to their original form. Cain was left with a decision that had no easy answer, caught between the instinct to fight back and the exhaustion of having already fought for something that turned out to be false. Lily was left to face the reality that her choices had consequences that extended beyond strategy, beyond immediate outcomes, into the realm of lasting damage. And somewhere beyond them both, the larger game continued, its next moves already in motion, its outcomes uncertain. What remained in the aftermath was not closure, but a lingering tension, a sense that this was not the end of the conflict but merely its transformation. Because once truth is exposed, it does not settle quietly. It reshapes everything it touches, forcing new decisions, new alliances, new betrayals. And in a world where trust can be weaponized and loyalty can be manipulated, the question is no longer whether someone will fall, but how far they will go before they do.